Hi guys, welcome back to the Lura Studios. Let's continue with our tax maker application by adding up more functionalities like the new tax activity, the provider, and implementing the main activity with its adapter. Heading straight to Under Studio, we'll continue from there. Looking at the layout, we need the activity main and the item since we're going to be using a recycler view in the activity main. A peep into the activity main, we have the structure this way, where we get to use the coordinator layout as the wrapper, with the upper layout right sitting on top of the toolbar. So we have a toolbar set up for this. And right inside this layout, we'll be having a recycler view where we're going to have the items and also the priorities icons by the side. We'll also be using the floating action button, which will enable the user to add a new task on click. This launch the add a new task activity. So that's cool. The items are needed. Firstly, we're going to be using a checkbox to actually depict probably you've actually completed the task or not. So that's the essence of the text box. And we'll be using a custom view called the tax title view. We're actually going to be looking at that in the Java classes, where you have the text description, which is the description of the tax. So you have that set up. As well, we're going to be using an image view, which is for the priority. Either it's of high priority or no priority. So that's the image view right there by the side with the date of the tax. So you're going to have that visualized right there in the main activity. Cool. Well, you have to add a menu. Firstly, the menu add tax, which will actually have the save uh, text, or let's say the save menu button, when you're adding a new tax to actually save that to the SQLite database. The second menu at this point in time is for the settings, where you need to actually call the settings activity to actually save some settings to the shared preference. So those are two menu XML, very important. And now looking at the drawable, we actually use the ICAD, which is this is for the floating action button. The priority, no priority, that's going to be an empty kind of orange. This is an empty kind of star icon, and the other priority is a full star icon. So you have that set up as a drawable vector. So it's a vector graphics, which you can also get from the vector graphics wizard. So that's cool. From here, head straight to the Java classes. Now we need to make few amendments. I'll be talking about the tax, which is the POJO, to actually set and get some values. The adapter, which we'll be using the main activity to bind to the view. The provider that will sit on top of the DB helper, which will enable the user to access the database required from the CRUD implementation to create, to read, to update, and delete. And we have the update service, which is like a helper class to actually assist the user as well. Now, quickly looking at the new tax activity, this will be triggered on click of the floating action button from the main activity. So this is actually going to create a new tax, and you have some fields set up to selected due date. You need to implement the onDate set listener, which will be calling the date picker dialog. You have that from the date picker fragment, and also the onClick listener on the view, because we're actually going to be triggering the save button. So you need to set an onClick listener to that. We'll get to look at the date picker fragment. This is just a simple fragment that extends the dialog fragment, and in the dialog you use the current date as the default date of the picker. So you're going to have the calendar, whereby you get the instance of the calendar, and from there you could get the year, the month, and the day of the month set all in an integer variable. So you need to create a new instance of the date picker dialog and return the instance where you have the date picker dialog instance, the pass the activity, and the onDate selector listener, passing on the year, the month, and the day. So those are very important. So it's actually going to return a value of a date picker dialog that's going to return the year, the month, and the day of month. Cool. So back to the new tax activity, so we could understand the date picker. Now we have some field here: the description, the switch for the priority, and the text view for the due dates. Also, we have a string for the date and a key, which is for the dates key. I will be using that to save to the SQLite database. You set the content view to the layout, and you initialize the views. At this point in time, you set an on-click listener to the date, and there's a method called update date display. So this method is actually going to update the display, and you could see that appropriately. We're trying to maintain screen orientation. That's why we call on the save instance state. So you have to first of all test if the save instance state is null, and you get the key passed from the date. So the date is actually going to be persistent on screen rotation. So you have that set up, and it could set back to the date view and also to the date. So you have that set. So on save instance state, this is when you actually put the character sequence into the key, which is the key date, which you have right there. Cool. And now what's the value? The value is going to be the date view when you get the text from the view. That view is actually after you might have called the date picker dialog to pick this, the appropriate date, month, and year, and now you've displayed that to the view. From that, you pick a copy of the value from the view and set that to an instance state. So you have that set up. Now you need to inflate the on options item selected menu, which is coming from the on create options menu, where we call on the menu attacks. This time we need the action save, which is actually going to be a menu right there at the toolbar, and this is going to trigger the save item, that save item to the SQLite database. We have to manage the selected date value, where you have a method called set date selection. This takes a long data type, which is actually the timestamp, and that's actually going to set that to the due date. At the point in time you update the display, the date display, we've actually called this method twice here, right there in the on create and at the same time in the on date selection. So we'll get to look at what that method is going to do. On click, that's for the date picker fragment. So it's actually going to click the event on due date. You call the date picker fragment and you show the fragment. Cool. On date set, when you're going to pass in the year, the month, the day, and the date picker view, this is actually going to set to known on the selected day. So on the day is actually going to be known. That's how you have it as 12, and minute 0 and second 0. That's for the time now. But the year and month is what you actually pick from the date picker. So you have that set to the set date selection method. The update date display, this is actually going to get the date selection and equate it with the maximum value that's equals to the maximum value. So it's actually going to set text that not set at the point in time when it's equated, or else it's actually going to pick the value of the due date and set that to the character sequence called formatted, and you set the text to the value that's for the due date when the tax is due for completion. Now the save item, this is actually going to pick some salient values. Firstly, it's going to pick the description of the tax. It's going to pick the priority, since it's actually going to be in one in integer, either 1 or 0. So if you toggle for the priority is 1, if you leave that untoggled, you have it as 0. So that's it. And for completion, it's actually once you check for completion, is either 1 or 0. Once you check is 1, unchecked 0. So you have that set up, but we are not having the check mark for the save new tax. You have that when you're trying to check right there in the main activity to actually depict that this is completed or not. For the due date, you get the date selection. That's a method which you actually are going to call right there, which returns the due date. And from the due date, where you're going to get that, which is from the selected timestamp, which you actually selected the month, the day, and the year. So you pass that right there into the content values, and you trigger the tax update service. This is actually right there from the data package where you have its tax update service. We have an inner method called the insert new tax, and this is where this is like a helper method that will help you to actually insert into the SQLite database. Let's quickly look at the tax update service. The inner method that actually triggered the insert new tax. We have it right there. There's a static method that takes in the context and the values. That's the content values as a parameter. So at this point in time, it calls the intent and also starts the service. That's the context starts service and passing the intent as the parameter. So that's what the tax is actually going to do, and it's going to insert into the SQLite database. We have the setup. So from here, we've concluded the new tax activity. Let's get to look at the data in question. What we'll be looking at, the first is the tax, the POJO, where we get the ID, the description. The complete is complete, a boolean, and the priority is in boolean, is either yes or no. And the due date, that is going to be in milliseconds. That's why we use a long data type. Now you're going to have a new tax, and from the discrete items, that's a constructor, and you pass in those values as the parameters, where you're going to be initializing the fields created up here. Cool. I hope you understand this. Now we also have another tax that actually creates a new tax with no due date. This is another form of constructor, overloading a constructor, whereby you're going to pass in now 3 parameters. The first constructor passing how many parameters? 4. Now this 3 parameters, the description, the complete scenario, and the priority scenario as well. So you've taken out the due date, so without a due date. Now we're going to also create another overloaded constructor with the database cursor. So this time is actually going to interact with the database, the SQLite database objects. Now you're going to pass in the cursor as a parameter. This time you get the data type, the get column long, that's of the cursor, and of the column itself, which is the ID. We have for the description, we have for the complete, priority, and due date. So you pass that and initialize the fields which you created earlier with their values. So once you call the different kind of tax, the parameters you're passing in will depict the constructor that will be picked from this tax class. Cool. That's set up. Looking at the provider, which should be familiar with provider at this point in time. I have bountiful of videos that are covered on providers, content providers, and SQLite database. Cool. I'll be taking a brochure on how this provider is. The clean job ID, we'll be talking about the job services later on. We have for the 2 kind of tags we need, the all the tags and the tags with an ID with their integer values, and the database helper. This will actually make us interact with the DB helper directly, so we could call some methods right there in the DB helper. Probably we need the get right table database or something. The URL matcher, we have to the URL matcher is a kind of logic that points to the right path that you're looking at. Are you calling to the tags, or you're pointing at the tags with an ID? So this URL matcher will be able to match with the right path of data you really need to call from the content provider. So this is very important. You could have URL matcher for bountiful tables right there in your SQLite database. This for the tags, all tags, and this for the tags with an ID. The DB helper is instantiated here, so it's usable at this point in time. Can you see it is used to get a readable database from the DB helper class? So this object of the DB helper could be used to get a readable database. Cool. In the query method, once you set up your provider by extending the content provider, you will be overriding few methods. You'll be overriding the get, the query method, the insert, and the update and the delete method. All implementation are done right there. In the query method, just you want to query the database, you want to fetch data from the database. It depends on how you want to fetch it, so that's why you use a case, the switch statement. For the tags, you want to fetch all the data from the tags table or from the tags database. Depends on where you're pointing at. You have a query this way. You point at the table called the table tags. You have the projection, a selection, and its arguments. if there is any, and the sort order, how you really want to sort data returned from the SQLite database. And tax with an ID, that's going to be a single tax. You have the selection now with an ID. This like a question mark. This is actually going to accept the value that you're passing into it. That what's going to be an ID, and that ID is the unique ID that's been assigned to each tax at the point of adding to the SQLite database. And its argument is going to actually, you're passing the ID, you pass the ID of the URI as the value of the URI. So you now have the selection and its arguments as a parameter right here, and the sort order. This is actually going to return a single row or a single value. So you have that set up. So it's actually as if you're actually querying all the tags or tags with an ID. So you have that set up. The same thing will go for the insert, but now you're going to insert into the tax table. You're not actually going to insert into one value. So you have it as tax and an inner method to actually execute this function, which is the insert tax method with two parameters, the URI and the values. Now the URI right there with those values. You still need to get writable database. Cool, because you're writing to a database, and now you're inserting the table tags into the table and the values. So at this point in time, you trigger the get context resolver notify change method. This is actually going to make probably there is a new insert to your SQLite database. So it's actually going to fetch this data immediately. So that's that. It's going to insert it immediately. At the same time, you could fetch immediately if you really want to query at a glance. Now you need to return the appended ID. That's a new inserted tax. Probably you've inserted a new tax, and you have to return its ID down for actually it's just like a dictionary. You need to actually add that to what you have right there in the SQLite database. So you have to get that returned. The updates, now you also could change the values. Probably you want to update the state of the completed, or you want to update the priority. So you could do that by updating the data using the tax with an ID. So you could update a specific tax. So with an ID, the ID will be able to dictate the particular tax that you are actually updating, and you pass in the value that you really want to update. So you have that set up, and the update tax will take responsibility of this action. And this update tax, what's going to do, you need to call on the database updates, the tax, the value, selection, and its argument. Which column is the selection? Which column are you updating? Is it the description? Is it the completed as priority or not? So where are you really updating? And you need to return the row updated, the integer, that ID of that row that was updated. So you need to return that. The delete, now you could delete the whole data in the tax table, and you could just delete a single row right there in the tax table. That's why you have two cases, the tax and the tax with an ID. So once you're deleting the tax, you're fetching, you want to empty the whole tax table, and you need to return the count. So you count the number that remains. Probably you in the row of 5, you deleted an ID with 4, so definitely it's going to remain 4 rows left. So you have to return the number of rows left. And if you are deleting all, that means it's going to return no rows. So you have to return that. So you could finish up the CRUD implementation here, the create, the read, update, and the delete. Let's move further. The update service, I've mentioned that we actually use the class, the A method there rather, which is the insert new tax. From here, I'll be looking at the tax title view. This is a custom view that we'll be using in the adapter, and this is actually going to depict a few things. You can see that extends the text view, and I want you to look at this aspect, the set state, which takes an integer of state, and now you're going to test which state are you right there. Is it a done state? Probably the tax is completed. So if you notice, there's going to be a paint strike through the text. So that's where you could see the strike through. Once you check on that, it's done. It's going to strike through. that means completed. And is it a normal? Are you still in a normal state? So it's actually going to depict which color? A black color. Despite that, so it's actually going to have the state of the tax will be in black. And when it's overdue, it has offshoot the due date. That means the tax is past the due date. It's overdue. It's actually going to have a red sign. That's a red text description. So you have that set up. So these are all a custom text view, which will be used right there in the adapter to bind to the data, so which can be visualized right there in the main activity. In the main activity, where you're going to actually finish up and we'll be binding the data, since you would have data from the SQLite database, we could use a loader to actually fetch data on the background thread, so that will not block the UI and it could actually display to the recycler view. So that's why we have the loader manager right there with its callbacks. Cool. And the tax adapter, which will be used to bind to the data, is very, very important as well. We need an integer for the tax loader. Well, we'll get to call that right there in the init loader method. Let's quickly run down this. Set the content view as usual. Initialize the toolbar and set the support action bar. And now initialize the floating action button as well, so that you could actually click on that to the add tax activity. And initialize the adapter and set on item click listener to the adapter. So that will actually take us to the detail activity. We're talking about the detail activity in the next tutorial. So we have the recycler view here, which is initialized, and you set that appropriately. Is the size you set to the adapter, and which layout manager you're using. This is just a linear layout manager. You could use a grid, you could use a staggered grid at this point in time. Now you trigger the get loader. Very important. Without this, the loader is not going to be triggered. And once you implement the loader callback, you're going to actually override a few methods. And the methods are on create loader, on load finished, and on loader reset. Before I look at that, we have the on click for the floating action button to actually point down to the new tax activity. Cool. We'll be having an on item click, which we'll be talking later on, which will usher us down to the detail activity. And the toggle, that's for the toggle states of the checkbox. Is the checkbox checked? Once it's checked, that is the state of completed. If not, it's still going to be empty. That's when you get to update the SQLite database. Once it's checked, there's going to be an adapter position gotten, which is from the adapter itself. And now let's see the content values, where you're going to be putting into the values that you're putting. That's what you use. Which column are you talking about? Is the complete column. That's just the selection. And now the values will be 1. Since once it's checked, that means completed 1. Unchecked, 0. So you could be updating anytime the checked or the item has been toggled. This method will be triggered to actually update the particular row, the particular ID, and the column is complete with a value of 1. You need to return the row selected. At this point in time, you get the content resolver to actually make that work. The content resolver will update the SQLite database, calling the update method, the tax URI which was clicked on. Okay, so how we got the tax URI. You got that from the content URIs with the appended ID of the adapter position of that click you made. We'll get to look at that further in the tax adapter. The values that you are actually putting in and the other null aspects. So this is actually going to update the SQLite database. Then create loader, we'll be talking about the settings when we're going to be sorting by default and also having some sort order. We sort by the date and we have a default sort. We're actually going to be doing that in the settings activity, and this is actually going to help us to pass into the query the sort order. So before you could even actually fetch that to the cursor and fetch bind that to the view in the adapter. So this is the projection. That's the columns are involved. They're calling the ID description, complete, priority, and due dates. And you return a new cursor loader This is actually going to be a bunch of objects in the cursor, and this takes a few parameters. This is the activity, the content URI you're pointing at, the columns, the projection, the selection null, the selection argument null, and the sort order, which is actually going to be ordered by the constant, which is gotten from the shared preference from what you set right there in the settings activity. We'll talk about the settings activity in subsequent videos. On load finish, you need to swap the cursor. This is where you have to fetch or feed the adapter with cursor data. So you swap the cursor. Once the data has been loaded and it has been passed into this cursor, it's going to actually fetch the adapter with this cursor. And on reset, you give the cursor a null value. So finished. At this point in time, you'll be set to consume data from the cursor right there in the adapter and bind to the views, the item views that you've created in the layout. Here we'll be looking at the tax adapter, which will be the last class we'll be talking about in this video. This extends the recycler view adapter. As usual, we have the on item click listener set, which will actually take care of the item click and the item toggled. That is for the checkbox, and for the item itself, which is being clicked to the detail activity. That's the two item listener we'll be looking at. We have an inner class called the tax order, where you have the views that you'll be binding to, the name, the date, the priority, and the checkbox. You've initialized all fields here, and you set the listener to what you need, which is the item click, item view, and the checkbox. For the toggle, on the click, you have the checkbox. You call the completion toggle method, and for the order, which is the post item click, which is actually for the detail activity. Now for the completion toggle, you have that calling the on item toggle. That's if it's checkbox. That's if the checkbox is checked, and it's going to actually get the position of the item that actually gets checked. That's the ID of that view. The same thing goes for the post item click. That's for the item view as a whole. That's the whole item on the row of a recycler view, and it's actually going to get the position as well. So these are the two things that will be handled right there. We have a constructor of the adapter where you get to initialize the cursor and its context. Cool. So we've been able to do that, and now we have a private cursor. This is where we're going to actually fetch those cursor we actually swapped from the main activity. On create view order, you need to inflate the list item, the tax, to actually bind data to this tax item. We've talked about this item, so this is where you now bind data to, so that it's actually going to get that visible right there in the main activity. On bind view order, now we want to bind values to the views. So you're going to bind the tax data to the views. Firstly, we are expecting a cursor, so we need to iterate through a cursor by move to the first position. After that, you get the string. You get the column index first, which is the index of each, or which is actually going to be an integer, and the point in time you now get its appropriate data type. Get string, get long, get int, and get the int, which is for due date, is complete, and priority respectively. And their columns, description, due date is complete, and its priority. You pass that to a variable. Variables, which you are actually going to be using to bind to the view. Now you won't just bind directly based on the due date, because now you need to set the helper method we have right there in the custom view of the due date. Firstly, you call the name view. You set the state to be 2. At what point will you set the state? If the due date is not equals to no date, that is, you can actually add the tax without a date. That's without a due date. So it's accepted. That could be null. That is the null aspect of the due date is accepted. But now if the due date is not equals to null, probably you've set a due date, and the time is greater than the due date. Now you have a time lapse that's as offshoot to the due date. You set the state to be 2. Now let's get to look at the state of 2, which is 0, 1, 2. Overdue. Overdue is going to be 2 because in array you have to count from 0. So now that's overdue. Sure, that's depicts the date is overdue. So at this point in time, the name, that is the description, will be read. Now another test of value is if you've actually checked for completed. That is, if it's complete is not equals to 0. Definitely it's going to be 1. Or if it's complete is 1. You set the state to be what? To be 1. Now let's look at the state of being 1, which is normal 0, 1. That's not equals to 0. Cool. And else the state should be 0. So we have that set up. Cool. Now the priority. If the priority is equals to 0, you're going to set a different image resource, which is no priority, which you have as an empty star. Else, definitely, that is of priority is going to have a full star. Cool. I think we've been able to actually do justice to this display. And now we also need to test for the tax if it has a due date. Now for the formatted kind of text view we want, that's the kind of text we want. Probably we just want 22nd of March, 30th of April. You understand? So that's actually the format we need for the date view. So that's why we use the date utilities to get relative time span in string. There's an inner method from the date class, and you pass in the context and the due date, that's the parameter. So it's actually going to format that and get that spit out in the format we needed it for. Also, we have the get item count. You need to override this definitely to count the number of objects right there in the cursor, and you also to retrieve a link or a tax for the data at the given position, and this is actually going to help us to get the data item position and a new field with a positions attribute. So that's the get item ID. Now look at the swap cursor. The swap cursor takes in the cursor parameter and actually notify the data set changed. So actually refresh any old cursor at the point in time. It's going to replace with the old one. The new cursor comes in, another cursor starts to bind to the view. So you have that set up. I will employ you to take a time to actually understand this very well, because this is where one of the major core aspects of this application is, where you get to bind the views, when you get to use the custom views to set the data appropriately, and you have that set up. So this is where you're going to have your item click on toggle click to actually do more functions with your application. Manifest will be the end, where we're going to actually lock in your provider. Very important. You need to actually set that to the metadata of your application, and at the same time you need to add the tax activity that was used. This is another tax we actually use, so you have to have this activity registered in your manifest. With all this, you're set to go. You could test your application, and you could actually test that in the device or in an emulator. So with this, I'll be stopping from here, and in the next video we'll be talking about the detail activity and the settings activity, where we get to extend more on our tax maker application. From here, I'll say bye bye for now. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and watch out for the next video. Thank you very much and have a lovely time. Bye bye for now.